BRI is an overseas interest today for China, and protection of these would become a main issue in the next decade onwards. For example, China has 36,000 state-owned enterprises, like the agreement we had with PetroChina, with the CNPC and others, or with Gajoba Dam, or with the Great Wall Hydroelectric Development Corporation, which is an SOE, state-owned enterprise. A state-owned enterprise is headed by a Communist Party member, and 100 state-owned enterprises, Communist Party members are directly sent to the Communist Party congresses. The 20th Party Congress was held in October. So it comes with huge party-state backup, these state-owned enterprises. So 36,000 state-owned enterprises are working abroad. Protection of that would be the duty of the PLA and PAPF in the future. People's Armed Police Force, which is their paramilitary force. Tourists, prior to COVID-19, they have 180 million tourists. I hear last year there was some ruckus in Kathmandu about the Chinese tourists. But this is the huge amount of tourists that China can bring about. Protection of these has now become a main problem in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Maghreb, Algeria, and Egypt, Syria, and other places. But essentially, it could also mean any other South Asian country other than Pakistan, Afghanistan in future. So tourist flows will also bring in huge military, paramilitary presence in South Asian region, as with the others. China had exported at $1.74 trillion of FDI so far. And protection again of these investments is going to be a big issue, which China has to address again with the PLA and PAPF. Trade routes, which are going to come up as the 6 main arteries of the BRI have been configured. That is where the deployment patterns will be there. So protecting overseas interests is the main concern here. That would emerge in about a decade's time as many conflicting issues will come up in the BRI implementation. As of now, it is just laying down the roads, railways, energy pipelines, fiber optics, airports and shipyards and others, but increasingly protecting these would be problematic. COVID-19 has, of course, reduced the importance of BRI because of the physical distancing and other border controls, lockdowns and others, including with South Asian countries where we have zero tourism, zero investments, zero almost people-to-people contact and others. In between, in April this year, Xi Jinping addressed the OAU Forum. So there are several advantages for China in this regard. Some compared that with the Marshall Plan, although we are not war-ravaged countries in South Asia, except Afghanistan, of course, and to an extent some other countries. But this is one which we could compare with. Chinese official position as far as the white papers that it had issued in 2015 to 2018 on the BRI indicates to these aspects. So let me skip those, come to the problems. China said it had invested $120 billion in BRI so far. But the Asian countries require $8 trillion in order to have our modernization completed. The IMF and World Bank are not going to give us this money. ADB is also not going to give these outlays. So we have to actually look for, and China's role there is important. Although it has only committed just about $100 billion, according to the official figures from China. These BRI projects are also very turbulent in South Asia. Terrorism or uncertainties, piracy in the Indian Ocean, South China Sea and Bay of Bengal. these are issues. Sovereignty disputes, again, are going to be problematic. And many of these are in the US-led world order and the Russian. So the conflict between US and Russia creates a lot of issues for the South Asia, indirectly. China also needs to consider the major powers in the BRI projects. The most critical thing is about the debts, which I heard in the morning. There are 17 countries so far which have fallen into debt. Prominent from South Asia is obviously, to an extent, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, of course, and Maldives. So there are huge lessons here to be learned. In the case of Bangladesh, excuse me, you are the expert, but let me show my ignorance here. $24 billion of agreements signed in 2016, that is equivalent to about 20% of Bangladeshi GDP. Here there is a problem emerging. If Bangladesh is growing at 6 to 7% a year, then it can manage all these debts. But if it is not growing for any reason, and last 1 year because of the COVID and other related problems, there has been a decline across the globe, not just Bangladesh, but across the globe. In fact, China itself is declining, relative decline. World Bank said 2.4% growth rate this year, while Chinese official National Bureau of Statistics mentioned 3.4% growth rate. So from 10% to 6% to 3.4% growth rate. So China would obviously find problem in finding resources for the BRI. 2 summit meetings have been held. The third meeting, only 26 foreign ministers were attending. And within this, Lavrov did not attend. He was there physically, but somebody read his speech. So Russians are murmuring about the BRI. During the Bali summit in G20 a few weeks ago, Xi Jinping mentioned to a press reporter that there will be a third summit meeting somewhere next year. So probably a mid-course correction would be made of all the problems that we have seen. Pakistan has a debt ratio of 86%. And so this is, and it is going for the IMF loans packages on that regard. So that is, in terms of Sri Lanka, the Chinese debt is about 10%, but actually it is about 24%. Some suggest to 24% so there is the debt issue that needs to be addressed. And I liked what Pompeo told the Nepalese foreign minister, the Secretary of State of the US. If you need this project, if you are desperate for this project, if you actually need this for your economic development, go ahead with that project. If you have a flashy project, capital-intensive project like Hambantota or Colombo Port project, these are not going to bring in returns for economic returns. So there is a concern here in terms of what we do with our debts in South Asia. Advantages for China in the BRI, many advantages. The CSIS, the Washington-based think tank, suggested that nearly 90% of the contracts go to the SOEs in China. None of our companies function in the BRI projects. There is a lot of course, the Chinese companies spread. I mentioned about those 36,000 SOEs of China in the... China is also using excessive capacities in the BRI construction. 2 years ago, prior to the COVID, China produced about 820 million tons of steel. That's about 50% of global production. China produced 24,000 metric tons of cement. That's about 54% of global cement. And BRI is about steel, cement, glass, whatever, all those for the infrastructure projects. So that is where China is now extensively using these excess capacities. For also in terms of technical talent, China produces 10 million graduates a year. and they could find jobs only for 4 million. So we're going to see 6 million of these offloaded in the BRI projects. All these graduates would be running all around in the BRI, which is good in a way, because this is young talent, but we also have to find jobs for ourselves, for our kids. So that is where the issue of competition comes up. I mentioned about the PLA, and 19th Communist Party Congress mentioned the Chinese military would be made a world-class military by 2049. A world-class military means from Kathmandu to Antarctica, you have to transport troops within 6 hours. From Kathmandu to Haiti, you have to transport troops in 6 hours' time. So that is what the Chinese are going to do in the Interregnum, and become a continental and maritime power. So, in relation to South Asia, we actually see China's investments have been very minimal in the South Asian region. These are coming in different formats, loans, aid, and others, but FDI as such is very minimal. Although American Enterprise Institute has suggested they have been investing hugely in the South Asian region, but this appears to be an exaggeration. Since my time is going to be up, I quickly skip some of these, focus on the country specific. So China, Pakistan, AEI suggests $66 billion investment for the past 2005 to 22, mainly in the construction jobs, construction work, about $50 billion. Trade is increasing, but still marginal, $27 billion still last year. FTA signed, but Pakistan is crib about this because of the dumping of goods. And there is some lesson for Nepal on this. So CPEC is the flagship program according to Li Keqiang, and CPEC projects have resulted in huge investments in the infrastructure, including in Gwadar port, in Huawei 5G networks and telecom and energy projects, hydroelectric projects and others. But the issue for China, for Pakistan is also loss in revenues. 6 to 8 billion in tax revenues lost due to the heavy dependence on China in the CPEC projects. Also, 20% of CPEC is debt-based finance. 80% of investment to generate 40,000 jobs for Pakistanis, but 80,000 jobs for the Chinese, according to the Chinese ambassador's statement in Islamabad. So assessment here for the Pakistan, as far as the BRI is concerned, is that the GDP is actually declining in the last few years, and China's returns could also decline. This is an issue, which means that there are potential Ammantotas in Pakistan, that is Gwadar, Jimani, or other areas. And somebody mentioned Chinese loans are coming at 4%. In Pakistan, it comes at 5%. Hanoi Metro came at 5% interest rate. The second phase of Hanoi, Vietnam Metro came at 5%. So the interest rates are pretty high as compared to the global. If you go for Dubai Holdings, Singapore Holdings, or ADB loans, these come at very low. And India contracted a very, very low interest rate with Japan for high-speed railway between Ahmedabad to Mumbai at 0.002 to be repaid in 52 years. So we pay nothing to Japan in this process. Delhi Metro is constructed by the Japanese loans and at very concessional rates. So you see there a huge difference between Chinese and the other. Actually, several projects have been cancelled because of terrorism or other related issues. Okay, quickly, China, Nepal, you have more knowledge about it. So I will skip here, except to state that the focus is again on connectivity, infrastructure, energy projects. But Budh-Gandak project has also resulted in the Nepalese Senate criticizing the corruption-related problems in domestic politics of Nepal. Investments in these sectors, $3.48 billion between 2005 to 2022 this year, mainly in energy and transportation networks. So again, let me skip. Nepal suffered because of the COVID border control procedures and many other factors. Sri Lanka, $13.94 billion in the past 2005 to 2022. Transportation sector received $5.6 billion. And the loans constitute about 10% of Sri Lanka's debt. Some suggest to about 24% the actual figures. Infrastructure projects are mentioned here in this slide, and also the FTA that is being discussed still. China Maldives, $1.23 billion investment. Well, when you compare with the Maldives GDP of $9 billion, this is quite a huge investment coming in, and the constraints that it may pose in future. These are some projects that they have conducted in Maldives, but former President Nasheed mentioned that China is involved in island grab in Maldives, and there is a huge concern in regard to the BRI projects in Maldives. China, Bangladesh, much of that is again in the connectivity related. $30 billion investment between 2005 to 22, energy, transportation sectors, but huge trade imbalance between Bangladesh and China. $24 billion is the overall trade, and 24 is the Chinese exports to Dhaka. These are some projects that have been conducted so far in the China, Afghanistan. China has been relatively silent on Afghanistan. $154 million investment so far, actual investment, despite all the calls about the Istanbul process, the various other initiatives that have been conducted. There is a promise of investment, but this has actually not happened. You may have seen those WhatsApp clippings 2 weeks ago about people jumping from the rooftops when the ISIS attacked a Chinese building, Chinese constructed building in Kabul, a guest house, and so there is a huge problem about terrorism in Afghanistan. Also about no fresh water and no electricity transportation networks. That constrains China's investment in the BRI in Afghanistan. Global responses to the BRI, let me skip because some of these were mentioned. Some observations here. One thing I will wind up. China triggered the current crises in Sri Lanka substantially. Wang Yi went to Sri Lanka in March, and one of the main points is to insist that the fertilizers that Sri Lanka imported from Qingdao, that needs to be paid back. He has been insisting on this because the Rajapaksa government announced a organic fertilizer policy, and they were importing only organic fertilizers, and that created tension in terms of food production, also in terms of imports, which is a marginal factor, but the most important aspect is Sri Lanka has to pay for all the rejected fertilizers. The ship went back and it has to be, all the expenses have to be paid by Sri Lanka. So far, there is not much progress in terms of the IMF bailout packages and the financial meltdown in Sri Lanka. In Pakistan, the current crisis is partly related to China, not fully related to China. It is, of course, the local domestic factors, terrorism and various others. But this is one where we need to really discuss on what happens if BRI projects are increased in South Asia. China's focus is not on economic returns. China's focus is on political returns, military returns, strategic returns. It's not about how much they're going to get in terms of the BRI projects. So that one needs to keep in mind, and that is where Sri Lanka and Pakistan. I spent a week in Hambantota port, and I saw only one ship landing, and all of that stuff was going into the Sri Lankan domestic market. And much of this is Indian merchandise, by the way, that those ships were carrying. And so it is a huge white elephant that was created. And reports of bribery, reports of so many other things mentioned in Sri Lankan press. So these are some issues that we need to. And finally, the assessment. There are beneficiaries and losers in BRI. Any economic project, any strategic project will have those losers and gainers. One of the benefits is, of course, the infrastructure projects, various infrastructure projects. Tomorrow or day after, or 10 years down the line, they start yielding economic returns once in a while. So we should expect something. So Pakistan should be expecting some benefits. Laos, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Myanmar, Nepal, Central Asian republics, Italy, Greece, and Kenya. In Kenya, when they were not able to pay back, the foreign ministry spokeswoman, Hua Chunying, said, we'll go and grab the project. We will conduct the project of manning the railway between the African coast. So that is a prospect that we also have to keep in mind. 14% of the 1,600 BRI projects currently are running into problems, mainly debt-related, but also other problems like environmental issues and others. The role of China's SOEs are very important here, that we need to be looking at more carefully. Losers are with debt, opaqueness, and environmental issues. If you have any arbitration of BRI projects, it has to be settled in a Chinese court, not in a Nepalese court in future. So be prepared for grooming lawyers in China rather than in Nepal. These arbitration procedures are going to be very complicated in future if you have any project problem. Risks and sustainability. Liu Ruopu, the Exim Bank former president, ex-president, said the average liability and debt ratios is the Chinese who was, and China disburses these loans through CDB, Exim Bank, and CNBC. So Exim Bank president was saying, former president is saying, the liability and debt ratios have reached 35 and 126% compared to the global. If you take a loan from IMF or World Bank, it comes at around 20% and 100%, but the Chinese come at 35 and 126%. So that's where